This week, we are continuing with Chapter 4, but we are shifting our attention toward one of the most important institutions in the sociology of aging, the family. When we talk about aging, we often talk about individuals. We talk about older adults, we talk about retirement, we talk about health, we talk about independence, but people rarely experience aging completely on their own. We age within families, we age within friendships, we age within communities, and the relationships we have with other people can have an enormous influence on our experiences of later life. This week, we are going to look at family relationships and intergenerational support. Our supplemental reading, Family Support in Graying Societies, gives us a particularly interesting opportunity to examine this because it compares families in the United States, Germany, and Italy. The report examines how families in these countries respond to population aging and how support moves between generations. And what it shows us is that family support is much more complicated than simply saying that adult children take care of their aging parents. Support can move in many different directions. Parents can support children, children can support parents, grandparents can help grandchildren, adult children can provide financial assistance. Family members can provide transportation, housework, home repairs, personal care, or emotional support. And the direction of support can change over the course of the life course. This is one of the most important ideas I want you to take away from this week's material. Family support is reciprocal, but it is not necessarily equal or constant. At different points in life, different generations may have greater resources or greater needs. Think about a family with young children. Parents may provide almost all of the resources and care. Later, those children become adults and may begin supporting their parents. At another point, grandparents may provide childcare for their grandchildren. The relationships change as people's circumstances change. So instead of thinking about family as a fixed structure, sociologists often think about family relationships as dynamic. And that connects directly to Powell's discussion in Chapter 4. Powell argues that families are made up of interpersonal relationships between and across generations, but those relationships are also influenced by larger public narratives and social policies. In other words, family is both personal and social. We experience family through our everyday relationships, but society also tells us what families are supposed to look like. Think about the phrase family responsibility. What does that mean? Does an adult child have a responsibility to care for an aging parent? If so, what does that responsibility involve? Does it mean providing money? Does it mean providing transportation? Does it mean helping with medical appointments? Does it mean moving a parent into your home? Does it mean providing personal care? And how much responsibility should families have before the government, employers, or other institutions become responsible? These questions do not have universal answers. Different societies answer them differently, and that is one of the most interesting things we can see in the Family Support in Graying Societies report. The researchers compared the United States with Germany and Italy. All three countries are experiencing population aging, but they have different cultural expectations and different social policies. For example, Americans are more likely than Germans and Italians to say that families or individuals themselves should bear primary responsibility for the economic well being of older adults. Germans and Italians are more likely to place that responsibility on government. That difference is sociologically important. It tells us that the question of who should care for older adults is not simply a practical question. It is also a question about cultural values and social policy. If a society believes that families should be primarily responsible for older adults, then families may be expected to provide more financial and practical support. If a society believes that government should bear more responsibility, then public programs may play a larger role. Neither approach exists completely independently of the other. Families and governments interact, and those relationships can change over time. This is one of the reasons Powell's discussion of family policy is so useful. He argues that social policy creates narratives about what families should do. For example, governments can encourage the idea that families should provide care for older relatives. That may sound like a celebration of family relationships, but there is another side to it. If governments assume that families will provide care, then governments may provide fewer resources themselves. The responsibility has effectively been shifted from the state to the family. This is particularly important when we think about unpaid caregiving. Care may be provided out of love, but that does not mean that care is free. Someone providing hours of unpaid care may have less time for paid employment. They may experience financial consequences. They may experience stress. They may have to change their living arrangements, and they may have less time for their own families and personal lives. So, when we say that families provide care, we should also ask who within the family is doing the work. And that question brings gender back into the conversation. Historically, women have performed a disproportionate amount of unpaid caregiving. That means that family caregiving is also connected to gender inequality. A social expectation that families should take care of their own can sound gender neutral. But if women are the people most likely to provide that care, then the consequences are not gender neutral. This is another example of why sociology asks us to look beyond the surface of apparently personal decisions. A daughter deciding to reduce her work hours to care for her mother may look like an individual family decision, but it may also reflect cultural expectations about women's caregiving roles. It may reflect the availability or cost of paid care. It may reflect workplace policies. It may reflect healthcare systems. It may reflect the family's financial resources. And it may reflect the absence of other alternatives. So, once again, a personal experience can reveal something about larger social structures. The Pew study also introduces us to the idea of the sandwich generation. The sandwich generation refers to adults who are simultaneously dealing with responsibilities involving their aging parents and their children. This can create a particularly complicated period of the life course. Imagine someone in their 40s or 50s. They may have children who need financial or emotional support. At the same time, they may have an aging parent who needs assistance. They may also be working full time. They may be trying to save for their own retirement, and they may have their own health concerns. So they can find themselves positioned between multiple generations. The Pew study found that nearly half of Americans in their 40s and 50s who were surveyed were in this kind of situation. This is an important reminder that population aging affects much more than people who are already old. When the number of older adults increases, the effects can be felt across entire families. Adult children may become caregivers. Grandchildren may become involved. Working age adults may have to balance employment and caregiving, and governments and employers may have to reconsider how their policies support families. This is what we mean when we talk about the social consequences of demographic change. A demographic shift is not simply a change in numbers, it changes relationships and institutions. Let's also think about the kinds of support families provide. When we hear the word caregiving, we might immediately imagine intensive personal care, helping someone bathe, helping someone get dressed, managing medications, providing medical assistance. But family support can be much broader than that. The Pew study found that Americans with aging parents were more likely to report helping with errands, housework, home repairs, and other day to day tasks than providing personal care or financial assistance. That is important because caregiving is not always obvious. A person might never describe themselves as a caregiver. They might simply say, I drive my mother to her appointments, or I do my dad's grocery shopping, or I help my parents with their bills, or I check on them every evening. These activities can become part of everyday family life, and because they are often unpaid and informal, they can be relatively invisible. This brings us back to Powell's idea of narrative. How do families tell stories about what they do for one another? Someone may describe caring for a parent as an obligation. Someone else may describe it as an expression of love. Another person may describe it as stressful. Another may see it as an opportunity to become closer to a parent. All of these experiences are possible, and the way people interpret their family roles matters. The same behavior can have very different meanings depending on the person and the social context. This is why Powell argues that family identity is something people continually negotiate. Families are not simply structures that exist independently of their members. People actively create and recreate their understanding of what their family means. They tell stories about themselves, they interpret their responsibilities, they negotiate relationships, and they respond to social expectations. This becomes particularly interesting when families do not fit traditional expectations. Families today can include biological families, blended families, single parent families, multi generational households, chosen families, LGBTQ plus families, and many other arrangements. So when we talk about the family, we need to be careful. There is no single family structure. and there is certainly no single way that families experience aging. This is also where the comparison between the United States, Germany, and Italy becomes useful. The report found substantial differences in how families support one another. For example, Italians were more likely than Americans or Germans to report living in multi generational arrangements, while Americans were more likely to report certain forms of financial assistance. The important point is not that one country has better families. The important point is that family relationships are influenced by social context. Housing systems matter, employment systems matter, healthcare systems matter, government policies matter, cultural expectations matter, and economic conditions matter. Family relationships exist within all of these larger structures. This is one of the reasons that sociologists study families. We are not simply interested in whether people love their parents or children. We are interested in how social institutions shape what families are able to do for one another. Imagine a family that wants to care for an aging parent at home. That family's ability to do so may depend on whether someone can take time off work. It may depend on whether the home is accessible. It may depend on whether the family can afford modifications. It may depend on whether healthcare services are available. It may depend on whether siblings live nearby. And it may depend on whether the older adult actually wants to remain at home. So, even something that sounds as simple as the family will take care of them contains a huge number of sociological questions. Who is the family? Who has the resources? Who performs the work? Who makes the decisions? Who pays for it? Who gets to choose? And what happens when the family cannot provide everything that is needed? Those questions will become increasingly important as we move through the rest of the course. The other thing I want you to notice is that support between generations does not only flow toward older adults. The Pew Research shows that parents also provide substantial support to their adult children. In the United States, many parents provide financial assistance to their adult children, as well as help with errands, household tasks, and childcare. This challenges the idea that older adults are simply dependent on younger generations. Older adults can be caregivers. They can provide financial assistance, they can provide childcare, they can provide emotional support, they can provide housing, they can provide knowledge and experience. So the relationship between generations is not simply one of dependency, it is reciprocal, although the type and amount of support can change over time. That is an important distinction. We should not automatically assume that aging means becoming a burden. Older adults continue to contribute to families and communities in many different ways. And this brings us back to one of the central themes of our course. The way we understand aging is shaped by the stories and assumptions our society tells about older people. If we imagine older adults primarily as dependent, we may overlook the enormous amount of support they provide to other generations. If we imagine families as naturally capable of providing unlimited care, we may overlook the economic and emotional costs of caregiving. And if we imagine family relationships as purely private, we may overlook the ways that government policies, workplaces, healthcare systems, and economic conditions shape what families can actually do. Sociology asks us to see all of those connections. So, as you work through this week's material, I want you to think about family as both a personal relationship and a social institution. Ask yourself how expectations about family responsibility are created. Ask yourself how support moves between generations. Ask yourself who provides care and what consequences that care can have. And think about the ways that government policy and economic conditions influence what families are able to do. Most importantly, remember that aging does not happen in isolation. People grow older within networks of relationships. Those relationships can provide support, but they can also create obligations, expectations, and sometimes stress. Understanding aging, therefore, requires us to understand not only older adults themselves, but also the families and social institutions surrounding them. And that is one of the central lessons of this week's material. To understand how people age, we have to understand the relationships in which aging takes place.